Chance Strickland presents an introductory training on Auth for developers who are experienced in front-end development. This training covers authentication methods, discussing email, password, two-factor authentication, biometrics, OAuth, JWT, and more.
Hey everyone, I wanted to welcome Chance the Dev on Twitter to this session, and he's going to be doing, gosh, you're doing a course, which I'm very excited about. And is it actually officially called Backend for Front-End Devs, or is that
Called
just the
front to
concept?
back.
Front to back, okay.
Yeah.
Is there a
And
landing
yeah,
page we
so
can check
I
out?
sorry, I
Mhm.
think we get a little delay here. What was that?
Is there like a landing page we can check out?
Oh yeah, of course. It's actually front to back.dev. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I think that will take you. I'm gonna actually double check that real quick because I haven't checked it out in a while. Um, maybe it's front to back. Maybe I got a .com and don't remember. No, I'm getting redirected to some weird place. Give me a moment. I don't know the website apparently to my own course. It's not really changed in a while, so
I just put it
why
in the
is
chat. It is front to back.dev. You were right.
yeah, that's what I thought, but I'm getting a weird redirect on my end. Huh. Oh, nope, there it is. Cool. Maybe I had a typo, wasn't paying attention. But anyway, yeah, it's front to back.dev. There you go.
Cool. Yeah, so excited. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started and kind of like what you are excited to teach today?
Sure, yeah. I am by trade a front-end engineer, which is kind of the basis for where I'm angling this course, but I've done a lot of work on a lot of React apps over the years. I worked on a relatively popular library many years ago called Reach UI. And that was a library initially started by Ryan Florence, but then I joined a team with him and Michael Jackson and started working on that library full time, shipped a ton of components there. And really that sort of low level front end component driven design, API design, that's kind of where I lived for several years. Got really deep into the React world from there. And ultimately went on to work on another similar library called Radix UI, which also has gotten quite popular and lots of users really excited about that. And worked on that team for a while before eventually joining the Remix team. And so I worked on the Remix core team for a few years and helped build that framework. And after the Shopify acquisition, I decided that I wanted to go back to startup world. So I am now working for a small startup called Replo, where we build a no-code page building application for Shopify storefronts that want to ship custom landing pages without writing code. So that's kind of like a very brief history in a nutshell of where I've been for the past few years. As far as the course is concerned, if you go to the landing page, you'll be greeted with giant bold letters that says backend for front end devs. And that's exactly what we're angling to do. We're angling to teach back-end development to people who are comfortable on the front end, but may have never actually worked on the back end. So for people who, um, for whatever reason, want to get to the other side of the stack, maybe they're just a little bit bored or they have like shiny object syndrome like I do and just like jumping from thing to thing. Maybe they just want to sort of round out their skill set and be more capable on both sides of the stack. Maybe they're looking for a promotion and feel like they're stuck. There's a bunch of different reasons why I think learning backend development is really useful for front-end developers. And I think it's really helpful to also have a front-end developer teach you that skill set because it is, I think front-end devs often have a very specific way of thinking that just sort of things can click a little bit better if you know where the other person's coming from. And so I'm kind of trying to take that angle and think more, how can I make this instruction more visual, more interactive, um, click better for people who just have that front end brain. So that's the course. And slowly working on this thing. Should ship it in within a few months, hopefully. But at the moment, you can just sort of follow along. There's a sign up form on the landing page if you want to get some content in your inbox before the course actually ships. So
Cool. And we're so excited today to kind of go through some stuff. So what are you going to walk through?
That's a great question. I, I've kind of gonna just like riff a little bit today, I think. But the first module that I'm working on right now is all about authentication. So we can talk a little bit about just sort of like authentication 101. I've talked to a lot of front-end engineers who are really interested in this topic. Every application with actual users, it will eventually need some form of authentication. So if you want to be comfortable implementing that yourself, or you want to reach out towards like a third-party service, no matter which angle you go, I think it's really, really useful to understand sort of the basics of how authentication works and what kind of choices lay in front of you when you are setting up authentication, because it's just one of those things that can seem really simple at the outset, but then you start digging in and trying to implement it, and you realize it's actually potentially quite complex, which is why we have a bunch of different authentication as a service products out there these days.
Okay, Chance, we are excited to see what we are digging into today.
Yeah, so I just to give a little high level brief intro to authentication and sort of understanding the basics, I think is a really great place to start. And then we can jump into some more specific strategies. And after I do that, we'll go through like a Q&A with the group. Maybe jump in a little deeper with some folks. I'm going to also turn my notifications off so you don't hear Slack things popping up from time to time. So that little Slack noise is always really annoying. But yeah, so authentication, we'll just sort of talk about yeah, like everybody knows what authentication is, right? Like you've got a user, they need to access certain privileged content, and so you need to authenticate them somehow, make sure that you know who they actually are and that they are who they say they are in order for them to access certain data. And so you need some way to authenticate them. And so, users, there's some mechanism for users needing to prove who they are. And so sort of break it down into three high-level steps. You need to make sure that you need to manage the connection between the user and the server. The server, presumably where the data is coming from, or a serverless platform, wherever your data lives, you need to manage that connection. You need to verify who they are, and then you need to approve certain permissions based on that authentication on that process. And so, it's obviously very important for data security. And there's different ways to actually do this when it comes to implementation. Like you've got different types of data sources, you have different types of servers. And so depending on your technology, you might reach for one method over another. Depending on your level of expertise in managing these things, your level of comfort in managing these things may also determine some of the strategies you're looking for, as well as just sort of the level of security, right? Like if you're shipping a blog that you have like 2 or 3 contributors to the blog and need to authenticate those users, you probably don't have a ton of super heavy security concerns compared to someone who is shipping something for the federal government or a giant healthcare organization with lots of sensitive data, right? So the sensitivity of your data also will probably influence some of your decisions in the authentication process. So in thinking through some of these things, like what are some common ways you sign into a website? You got your email and password. That's very common, probably the most common, most popular method of authentication. But these days, email and password have, I wouldn't say fallen by the wayside, but oftentimes they're not quite enough on their own. And so we've seen the rise of two-factor authentication, where you put in your password and then there's an extra step required to verify that you say you are from there. You've got biometrics with Touch ID, Face ID, that sort of thing. You've got email authentication, where you get sent through your email a magic link of some kind, so you can only access that content once you've confirmed your email directly. So a bunch of different ways. You've got OAuth, where you can authenticate through another third-party service like Facebook or GitHub or Google. And so those third-party services sort of manage your connection for you. And then you have single sign-on authentication, which is pretty prominent in large-scale organizations where you might have a ton of different SaaS services. And if you had to manage those independently, imagine that you are an employee for a large company and you have 20, 30, 40 SaaS products that you have to use, and you quit your job, right? Your team probably wants to manage that access, and they don't want you to have access after you've left that job, and for them to have to go in and for the IT person at that company to go in and try and like manage all of those different services independently is kind of a pain. And also for you as the employee is kind of a pain because you now have to remember how you logged in to 20 or 30 or 40 different services, which is sadly kind of the norm these days. But so now we have the advent of single sign-on, where you sign into a single service, and that service, like Okta or WorkOS, lots of different services that manage single sign-on for you, so that it's as simple as signing on to that service and then having that service manage all of those different connections and authentication strategies for you, which is pretty nice if you do have to use 20, 30, or 40 SaaS services. And so, yeah, that's kind of just a high level look at the different types of authentication that you might encounter. And again, how you actually make that decision depends on a number of factors. Well, let's start by presuming that you are building a pretty small application, and you've got a pretty traditional setup where there's a server talking to the client. You've got a front end stack and a back end stack, and those two things have to talk to one another. And a very simple and tried and true method for authentication is server session based auth. So using the HTTP protocol to send back and forth cookies and establishing a session on your server to basically manage this session state on the server, and then sending a cookie back and forth to the client to let the client know that you are authenticated in an active session on that server. And so, you know, HTTP itself is stateless, and so you need some sort of form of communication between the stateful server and the client to let the client know that you're indeed authenticated, and that's where the cookies are involved. And so when you send a request to your server, you're going to have some identifying cookie on your machine that is going to go off to the server. The server is going to validate that and send back a response with the validated cookie. So that's kind of a very typical traditional setup. It's been used for many, many years, and it still works really, really well for a lot of applications. But there's also serverless architectures, right? Like in some cases, you don't have a stateful server that can manage those sessions. And so how can you actually verify that you're continuously logged in if there's no state? Like, think about the fact that you don't want every single request to have to revalidate you. That would be kind of nuts, right? Like if I logged in, got back a confirmation, was allowed to see my dashboard, clicked to another page, and there was a navigation which submitted another request, and now I had to revalidate, and you'd have to log in every single time you navigated. That would be kind of ridiculous, right? And so there are ways to get around that without having to involve server-side state. And typically what that would be token-based authentication. So you'd use something like JSON Web Tokens, JWT, if you're not familiar. So if you ever hear the term JWT, it stands for JSON Web Tokens, and it's essentially, it's similar in the sense that you're still sending back, like think with what I just said about server session authentication, where you're sending this cookie back and forth in each request. With JWT, you're sending back a web token, and this web token is going to be hashed. It's going to have some identity, some of your identity credentials hashed and secured before they're sent back and forth over the wire. And every time that token goes back and forth across the wire, it's got that your authenticated information stored inside of that. And so if you are sending that request off to some serverless entity, you can sort of manage that authenticated session, so to speak, through this token, right? And so you're going to see that is pretty common with serverless architectures. You can also use this technique with a traditional server client relationship. You can manage use JWTs to manage auth state purely on the client as well once you already have the data authenticated. And in general, there's like a few benefits to this, right? Like it's stateless, which if you've ever worked in any sort of application that is involved any sort of state, now you have to manage that state. Managing state can be very, very complex, right? And so managing authentication on the server is no different. There can be a lot of complexity in managing that state, and you don't need to have to worry about the server storing or managing that information. A JWT token or a JWT. It's one of those things where you say JWT token, but then you realize the T stands for token, so it's kind of redundant. So my don't mind my little aside here, but it's just if you hear me say that and you're pedantic, I'm sorry. But JWT, rather, you can store any type of data that you want in a JWT, right? So with a cookie, you're just sort of storing a session ID and you're going back and forth to the server to get any other data that you want. Whereas with a JWT, you can actually cram pretty much anything into a JWT. And once the client has that, you sort of already have all of that information. As long as it's, validated JSON, it's fine. So there's some just efficiency benefits there. You can also reduce the number of times you have to request data from your database. Versus cookie authentication. It's also can be considered quite simple to implement by comparison. Although I don't really think that cookie-based authentication is that complex on the implementation side once you know how to do it, but a lot of people find JWT to be a little simpler. So just a little quick overview of I think JWT and cookie session authentication are probably going to be the two most common things you see in traditional applications. And
Question
so,
for you.
yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, you're talking about cookie-based server authentication and then, of course, token-based serverless. Are there security considerations for either version?
There's always security implications for any authentication mechanism. You definitely want to make sure that sensitive information is hashed and protected before it crosses the wire. That's true with any sensitive data that is crossing the wire. Because when you send information through a request, that request can be potentially hijacked if you are, hacked or something. So there's always going to be things you have to think about in terms of protecting that data. So let's say you've got a typical email password form. You don't want to just send the raw password data across the wire. You want to send a hashed version, and you want the server to be able to have access to a key that can unlock what the actual value is based on that hash. And so that's going to be true whether it's JWT, whether it's session based, because that password has to get from point A to point B in either event. I will say that, like, aside from just like the password, I think there probably are more things you have to think about in that realm with JWT, just because oftentimes there's way more data stored in a JWT, right? It's not just a session ID. You've potentially got a bunch of different data. Some of it may or may not be sensitive that you need to transmit. And so through that transmission, you just need to make sure that all of that data is protected. And so the more data you're sending back and forth, the more surface area there are for security holes.
Yeah, that's something we've experienced before on a project. You have to make sure when you're messing with tokens that you're only sending the required information most of the time. I think that's just the best practice we learned.
Exactly. And I think it can be a bit of a foot gun because, that, like I said, I think with JWT, it's more convenient because you can send more information or store more information in a token. But the trade-off there is that it gets too easy to store information, and then you want to store everything in a token, and now you've got all of these potential attack vectors. So, it's not always a great idea to store everything in a token, and be very careful about what you do transmit through those tokens. Cool. That's a great question. So, yeah, I think at a very high level, those are the two most common forms of like sort of do-it-yourself authentication strategies that you're going to see. Like I said, there are other forms that have nothing to do with email and password. You've got magic link authentication through email. You've got OAuth. And so we can talk a little bit about those at first. We'll talk a little bit about SSO, but I think that's going to be probably an exception to what most people are building, unless you're building for enterprise, in which case you probably have some competent backend engineers on the team already who are kind of working on some of these solutions. But OAuth stands for open authorization. This is also very common to see, where anytime you go to log into a site or a service, there's a button that says login via Google or GitHub or whatever it is. You are participating in OAuth authentication. So OAuth basically is you granting permissions to a third party to authorize your identity on your behalf to the service. And so, yeah, Twitter, Google, a bunch of different third-party services allow you to authenticate via OAuth. And so how does it work? Essentially, you are going to submit there's going to be a client ID, like a username, right? Like that client ID may be associated with your GitHub email, maybe associated with a GitHub ID or a Twitter ID. Every third-party service might have a different client ID that it provides for you. It's also going to involve a secret. So the app may generate some sort of secret token. There's going to be an authorization that happens on the server. And then the server is going to authenticate you based on that information that it gets from the third party, and then it's going to grant or deny you certain privileges. And the way that it actually works under the hood, there's a bunch of different ways it can work, and it depends on both the service as well as the configuration on your server. But all kind of have the same general flow, whereas your initial request is going to hit the auth server through whatever service you're reaching for. So it's going to reach out to, say, GitHub, or sorry, first you're going to reach out to the actual server where the resources are, and that server is going to send back a callback URL to, say, GitHub, and GitHub is going to then prompt you to if you're not logged into GitHub directly, you'll have to log in then to GitHub. Once you've logged in there, it's going to prompt you to grant certain permissions to that server. And so this is to get to a point where you need to actually manage certain types of roles and permissions. I think this is where OAuth comes in really handy, because roles and permissions are also quite complex. And so going back to our discussion on server sessions, if you have to manage all of that stuff yourself, it's like an additional layer of complexity, right? Like if there's different levels of authentication. So you might have like a super user who can sort of manage other users, manage specific privileged data that other users can't, and then levels below that. This is where OAuth can come in really handy, because a lot of these third parties provide different roles for you, which is quite nice. And so when you hit that callback URL and GitHub prompts you to grant permission, it's going to ask you to grant specific roles to or specific access levels to privileged content to this provider. Once you authenticate there, GitHub is then going to send that authorization back to your server. Your server is going to validate that, and then you will be allowed to access that privileged data. And in that case, it's quite nice for the user, because they don't have an additional username password to remember. They can just log into GitHub, and GitHub will manage that authentication for you, which is also quite nice. And in terms of simplicity and setup, to me, it's just as simple to set up OAuth authentication as it is with JWT. Again, you don't have any additional state you have to manage on your own server. You just need to manage those transactions. And so once you are authenticated, that session is sort of managed by the third party. Excuse me. Yeah, any questions about that? It's like a very high level overview, but that's kind of the general gist of how OAuth is going to look.
I know a feature of OAuth is also refresh tokens, and that's kind of part of their security pattern. Is they offer you a token, you hold that token, it expires after a while. When it expires, you refresh it.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about that a little bit more, maybe?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, exactly as you said, a refresh token is going to be issued to the client. It's going to be quote unquote authenticated. It's going to persist for a certain amount of time. Um, and if your refresh tokens are too open, if they're allowed to persist for too long, the longer your refresh token is allowed to stay, I guess, open or authenticated. It's just sort of like it increases the likelihood of a potential attack or potential exposure, right? Like you don't want those things to persist forever. You want people to have to re-authenticate at a certain amount of time because other people might use that machine, right? Like if you're logged in at a library, say, and that library for one reason or another has failed to implement any basic security protocol whatsoever, or you just walk away to use the bathroom and someone sits down at your computer and decides to use it, right? Like these refresh tokens sort of give you power to restrain the amount of time that you stay logged into that service. It's really no different than if you were managing a cookie on your server. Those cookies also contain sort of a timeout where at a certain point you have to re-authenticate. And
So what
so,
you're saying is when I get logged out of a system, this is what's happening behind the scenes. Like I'm using the thing, all of
mhm.
a sudden I'm logged out. I need to log back in. My cookie or my token refreshed. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's one potential case, or maybe the third party service itself also logged you out because it has on the third party service is managing that state on the server itself, and so you get logged out of GitHub, and that can also like trigger that refresh token, even if the time of that refresh token hadn't necessarily timed out. There are different ways that you can get logged out of a system of an OAuth system like that. But yeah, the refresh token, if it expires, you just have to go back in and re-log in. You see this all the time. I feel like Gmail's or Google's tokens, whatever they use behind the scenes there, I feel like I have to re-log into Google constantly, which is probably a good thing because we all use Google for everything, including OAuth. So it's really it's a slight inconvenience for the user, but very, very important if you want to secure your data to make sure that you don't have these really big windows for how long those refresh tokens last.
Yeah. We got a couple questions from the chat for you. Um, One is Jan is curious if you have experience with building your own OAuth service and what could be the use case for building one.
I don't, but a use case is if you were to, let's say you wanted to build your own SSO service, right? Like you didn't want to use a third party service to build SSO, right? You could use OAuth to do that, right? You could build your own application to manage all of these different logins and have those connections to every single SaaS service integrate with your third party. Now, the problem with that is that those services would have to have an authentication strategy for your app, and most of them will not. So it's probably not a great idea if you're using third party SaaS services. But if you have different internal tools where those internal tools might need to authenticate through another internal tool, and you only want to manage authentication in one place, that might be a really good use case for building your own OAuth service. The challenge with or the reason that you probably don't want to build your own OAuth service most of the time is because most other tools are not going to have any sort of interoperability with that system because they don't know about it. So unless you're building, something with the intent to grow to the point where um, other things are going to start opting into your service, then it might not be super useful. But if you are building internal tooling and you have a bunch of different internal applications and you want to authenticate those through your own hand handwritten OAuth service, then that's certainly something you might want to consider. I've never personally had to do that, thankfully.
Before we get back to our conversation, we wanted to say thank you to This.Labs, who is the sponsor of today's show. If you need help with a project that has failed to deliver on time, or are in need of a team that feels true ownership over your engineering projects, definitely hit up This.Labs. They specialize in helping business leaders ensure their strategic digital initiatives stay on track. Trusted by companies like PlayStation, Capital One, Herman Miller, PayPal, and T-Mobile, you can find them at thisdot.co. That's THISDOT.co. Now, let's return to our show.
I almost had to do it one time. It was not a fun experience because there's
What was your case? I'm curious.
yeah, I'm trying to remember when I was doing it. We were building a e-commerce platform that was integrating with a bunch of third-party services. And what we wanted to do was um, allow users to have a single sign-on for both their marketing platform as well as access to our system. So it was just one login to rule it all, make it a better kind of flow experience. We backed out of that idea very quickly when we realized some of the limitations of it, but it was doing all the research and kind of learning, oh, there's 6 handshakes we need to do, and then we also have to store these tokens, make sure the refresh works in a certain way. We quickly backed out of it. So I agree with saying, luckily we didn't have to build it, but we know when to build it. I think you hit all the key use cases though. Another question from the chat. Going back to I call them jots, if that makes you feel any better with pedanticness. But how does invalidation of JWTs work after they've been issued? And then they said an example is to say there's a couple of devices logged in to a service and the user revokes access from one of the devices from the settings page so that the revoked device would need to log in again.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one of the big challenges with JWT or JOT. That's gonna haunt my dreams forever. I don't know where
I
that.
know somebody who calls it a JIT, if that makes you feel any better.
There's no vowels. It's just like, is W a vowel
I
in the UK or something?
I don't know, but
Okay.
he's a West Coaster, so
Fair. Yeah. So invalidating tokens is it's extremely complicated and challenging, and it's one of the reasons that I think I'd say JWTs are deceptively simple, because when it comes to invalidating them, it can be not so much. So uh, tokens are sort of valid for a set amount of time, right? So once you create a token, it's got validation date sort of like baked into it, right? And so um, actually trying to invalidate that across the board, so let's say across various devices, can be very, very tricky. And so you can't actually invalidate them against is that they're bearer tokens, and the validation is sort of baked into that token, but you can still do a couple things to try and manage this. Like, first of all, this goes back to our discussion about like these refresh tokens with OAuth. You want to make sure that the life cycle of this thing is pretty short. The longer your tokens are valid for, the harder this becomes to actually like maintain protected data. And so, um, yeah, I'm curious to get your take, Dustin. You've probably built a lot of applications using JOTs, as you say.
yeah. I was actually going to say there is a way to invalidate them. So one of the best practices you're supposed to do with when you're doing this type of token based is you actually want to store them. And Jamie, in the case that you called out of device specific stuff, you also want to assign tokens per device. And you kind of have them in a Redis or a Postgres, probably a Redis though, preferably because you want quick access to them. And like Chance said, they do have kind of an expiration set to them. But if you're in a state where it's like, hey, I need to, somebody got a token that they weren't supposed to, I need to kill that token. Part of what you should do is build an authorizer. So when a request comes in, you validate that the JWT is still valid against your internal data store. And if that's true, let it proceed. If not, invalidate, send the 401, 403. I always forget which one, but you send one of those and it's invalidated at that point. So you have to kind of like, while the JWT is still a valid JWT, it is server invalidated. And that's how you kind of protect yourself. And you can do that with serverless infrastructure as well, quite easily. Actually, if you go to Lambda, they have a thing you can put in front of every single Lambda called an authorizer function that does its entire purpose is what I just described. So that's
Cool.
my
Yeah,
experience with it.
that makes a lot of sense. I've not worked with JOTs in a long time, so my
I got a
instinct here
convert
is
here.
probably a little old. Nice, yeah. I've always found them to be quite a pain to revoke access through, and to your point, like to actually do this well, you're probably going to introduce some sort of other tooling, like a Redis cache or database of some sort, to sort of manage those for you. which, like I said, the deceptive simplicity then starts to go out the window, where now you have Redis, which is a whole other can of worms.
I'm going to give you the horror story that I have about this. So we were working on a platform, then our only way to do any type of authentication with it was using JWT's JATs. And the security team for the team we were working with said, "Hey, you can't use that because you can't invalidate them." Was our whole thing, and this compiled by the fact that every time a new request was sent, or like so when the front end refreshed on this platform, a new JWT was issued to that account on every single refresh that wasn't unique, and there was no invalidation pattern. So like I think another kind of best practice thing to call out here is if you're building a JWT issuer, always provide the same JWT while the expiration period is still true, and then later invalidate it or provide a new one once it expires. Like otherwise you're going to cause problems for somebody downstream.
Yeah, and you're talking about rotating keys, right?
I'm talking about, it's not even rotating in this case. It was every time, imagine you're on some web page, you're logged in, you refresh, you get a new JWT based off of some arbitrary, I think they use some date time hash as part of their algorithm for like issuing keys. So they didn't go look up in a Redis to provide the key. They just gave you a new key every single time.
I see. So yeah, so basically the original key has a very short lifespan, and that next time you get a new key, it's sort of like, it's like hitting a reset, but with a new key, basically.
Yeah. No, I mean that's kind of how we solved it. That was our solution. And we're only going to make these things last 5 minutes, and we're going to put nothing in them. Like
right.
They're going to have minimum viable. And the security team was like, "Is that the best you could do?" I was like, "Yeah." And they gave us the A-OK, but they weren't happy because we didn't have invalidation power. So
yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah. Last current question in the chat, going back to OAuth now. We've jumped all over the place. Dario would like to know, could you give us a bit more information about PKCE and when it is recommended to use?
I cannot. I don't know enough about PKCE to know and have any recommendations there, unfortunately.
Ditto. Sorry, Dario. You're SOL this time.
I'm putting that in my notes because now I need to research this, because if it's a question that comes up in the context of my course, I'm going to have to learn. So PKCE. Noted.
Yeah. So, Chance, maybe I'm going to direct you in a direction, and you tell me if you're okay going this way. But,
Sure.
We've been talking about Auth kind of at a high level, and you're talking about in your course, you're going to actually be building this a little bit. I'm guessing since you're on the Remix team, you're probably going to be using Remix as part of how you do your course. Can you tell us a little bit more about maybe how Auth kind of plays into the meta framework story?
Sure, yeah. And so to be clear, I'm no longer on the Remix team. I was on the Remix team until no, it's okay. I don't want folks to think I'm still responsible for their all of their Remix woes if they have them. But no, I'm kidding. I still love Remix, and I probably actually I'm certainly going to be using it in some capacity in my course, simply because it's what I'm the most familiar with in terms of the meta frameworks. But it's no different in Remix, and it would be in say Next or any other meta framework that involves a server. Anytime you've got a server, I think the appeal to traditional cookie-based authentication is kind of becomes more easy to reach for, just because you already have that server-client relationship. They're sort of baked into the meta framework, and so looking at Remix, there are actually there's a package that a prominent community member maintains called Remix Auth that uses cookie-based authentication for things like email, password, that sort of thing. And then you can bring in OAuth to the story when you want to introduce, like, say, GitHub strategies. Have you ever used what was the really popular auth library that I'm like blanking on the name in the JavaScript space for quite some time? It was Passport, right? Passport JS, was that it? Yeah. Passport. So Passport was this really popular library that a lot of Node developers would use to introduce authentication by bringing in certain strategies, as they'd call them, authentication strategies that all sort of shared a common interface and API, so that it was easy to, say, extend from just email password to add in a class for, say, GitHub or Magic Link authentication, and they would share this interface in the code for actually wiring them all up. And so it was quite convenient and easy to bring in these different sort of types of authentication. And Remix Auth adds that a similar kind of interface, but specifically for Remix. And so how that relationship works in Remix or any other meta framework really is that in Remix, you've got the idea of basically you've got a route, right? And that route is going to, you hit the URL, you're going to see something on the screen. So it's going to have a view, but oftentimes what is on that view is going to depend on data on the server, particularly if there's dynamic data involved. So if you've got like a dynamic slug for, say, a blog post or an ID of some sort of resource, that ID is going to be used on the server to generate some data and send that back to the client. And oftentimes that data, if it's protected, is going to have to go through some steps for authentication. And so oftentimes what you'll see in a Remix app is you will have routes specific to handling authentication. So you'll have a login route, a logout route, a sign up route, and those routes are sort of responsible for managing authentication for you. So if I go to /login, for example, and I'm going to see a login form, in Remix has this idea of loaders and actions. Loaders are responsible for handling all the GET requests to that URL, that route. Actions are handling all of the post requests. And so when I submit that login form, that's going to submit a post request, assuming your form has a form action of post. And it's going to send a post request to the server. And then in Remix, all of that, the data from that request is going to go into the request of your action function. And so you're going to invoke that function, take that form data, do all of your validation. So let's say a password comes through. That password at this point, like that password is plain text, right? Like comes from the client to the server. That server has to validate that somehow, right? If it's validating it in your database, you're probably not storing those credentials in plain text. So this is where hashing comes into play. You would hash that password and compare it using the unlock key or the unhash key to the password stored in your database or wherever that password happens to be stored. You'd go through the steps of authentication there, and once you're validated, you could redirect the user to, say, a dashboard, right, with that cookie, and that cookie is going to be the key to establishing that session. The server is going to maintain that session, send that back to the client, so that the client then has that cookie that it can send back and forth each time a subsequent request is made to ensure that the server continues to authenticate you. So that's kind of how traditional server-side cookie-based authentication would work in Remix. You could also use a JWT token if you wanted to, but I think if you already kind of have a stateful server available to you, it's just the appeal of other strategies, or of JWT at least, is a little lower in my view, because I think tools like Remix, or even Next for that matter, just make it a lot simpler to implement session-based authentication. But oftentimes you don't necessarily want username password, so you might want a no auth strategy, right? Like, so you can send a request or you click the GitHub button, and that sends a request to your server with a callback URL. That callback URL is going to then Remix server will redirect you to that callback URL where you will authenticate via GitHub, and then GitHub can communicate your back and forth to your server and authenticate you through OAuth the same way. But the main point I'm trying to make is that any tool like this is no different in Remix or Next than, say, if you're managing your own node server. The main difference is where you write your code. So like in Remix, all of your routes are sort of managed in the same place. If you've got a traditional node server, you may have your front end routes and then your API routes that are all sort of like responsible for different things. And most of the time in a Remix app, you're not going to have that because it's just not nearly as ergonomic to do it that way. But it's truly still, at the end of the day, just HTTP. And any way that you would manage any other HTTP request, it's going to look basically the same. It's just a little nicer to have everything in the same route.
So I want to tie something you said earlier to what you're saying now. and it's probably just my misconception of these platforms, so we'll go that route. My understanding of both Remix and Next, but let's focus on Remix for a second, is you can deploy Remix to either a serverful, stateful instance, or you could deploy all of the kind of endpoints as serverless functions in the cloud somehow.
Sure.
I think my understanding of the platform's right. I think the same is true with Next. So the question becomes, earlier you said in a serverless environment, it's harder to do these session-based cookies because you don't have the state. How do you achieve, let's say you're in Remix, you do want the session-based cookies, but you decide to deploy in the serverless fashion. Like
Mm-hmm.
how would I need to think about that? How would that change my approach?
So it actually doesn't change it too much at all because Remix has this concept of adapters to various deploy targets. I can't really speak as much to Next because Next it's a product that is maintained and shipped by the Vercel team, and so naturally they make that extremely easy to deploy to Vercel. I don't know as much about deploying things like Next to other targets, but it's certainly possible. I know teams do it. I just can't really speak to the specifics, but with Remix specifically, you have adapters, and anyone can actually build their own adapter to a platform. Remix is essentially giving you, like, Remix is actually really simple. It's a lot simpler than I think a lot of people realize, but it's the core of Remix really is a function that has a shared interface that allows you to manage requests, and that's kind of it. It's a function that will return a request handler. And so beyond that, it's just the compiler, right? And even now, like, it's not even a compiler. It's integrated deeply with Vite, which just use a Vite plugin to deal with the compilation of your routes. And so the compiler and the request handler function it's kind of like that's it with Remix. And so you can build your own adapter using that interface to pretty much any deploy targets, and a lot of folks have. But the Remix core team maintains adapters for serverless platforms. They maintain an adapter for AWS Architect. They maintain an adapter for Cloudflare Workers, Cloudflare Pages. So they're not all traditional servers. And like I said, I believe there are some community adapters for other deploy targets. I'm just going to do a quick Google here to see what's out there. Yeah, there's a whole discussion I'll drop here in the chat where Ryan had asked how they want to sort of surface these so that the broader community could sort of share what they're working on. But yeah, essentially anyone can build an adapter, and as long as it shares that interface, then how you wire that up is going to be different depending on your target. But as far as Remix is concerned, you still have all the same core APIs for managing cookies. And so in the context of a Remix application, you should be able to manage cookies the same way, whether you're deploying to AWS or whether you're deploying to, your own server using Node, right? The actual APIs for that should look pretty similar.
I think the question I was trying to maybe go at is, and thank you for that explanation. I think that's super awesome. But like, you're still saying we are able to deploy to maybe some type of serverless cloud infrastructure. And earlier, when you were kind of explaining the different methodologies, you said that cookie-based sessions weren't as doable in the serverless ecosystems. So I guess the question becomes, if Remix is deploying that way, or other platforms, how would we bring the cookie-based session authentication to those platforms and systems when they're in that deployment target where it shouldn't be as possible?
Are you asking, you're not asking specific to Remix then? Are you thinking more like generally speaking, like?
I was trying to go a little more general, but I figured how Remix does it would be a good explanation to how most people probably have to do it.
Yeah, I don't know, like, beyond the core Remix side how you would actually do that. So like I said, with Remix, you shouldn't have to think about it as much because the adapter sort of handles that translation between the code that you write and what's actually sent to the server or the serverless target, whatever it is you're managing a connection with. So I don't really have any direct experience doing cookie-based authentication on serverless like Lambda functions or anything like that, if that's what you're asking about. So I'm not actually sure. That's a good topic to explore, though. So I'm going to add that to my notes.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Um, Kind of while we're on the topic on kind of Remix, which provides some SSR capabilities. Dan had a question.
Sure.
If you had any suggestions for tools or strategies to audit our SSR apps for some of
Mm.
the security vulnerabilities that might be occurring while we're trying to implement our authentication.
Uh, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I mean, there's certainly best practices in terms of auditing, um, beyond like bringing in a consultant who's like does this audit for you. No, I'm not entirely sure. That's another good thing I should probably look into. Auditing
Building the
tools.
course as we go, right?
No, like this is I love this stuff. Like I'm a big proponent of learning in public, so I'm never afraid to tell you I don't know something.
Love it.
For server security holes. Yeah, on all the teams that I've worked on, we've had other people do all of our security auditing. That's like, it's not that I'm not interested in learning these things. It's that I'm scared of, I'm really scared of like, of security. And I want to be very, very sure that I have an expert doing these things, or at least like leading these efforts. Security scares me.
Amen.
Particularly if you've ever worked on a team with sensitive, like I used to work in health tech and worked on electronic health record software. And yeah, you imagine the sensitivity of the information you have to work with there. It's pretty intense. And I very much would prefer to stay out of that level of security.
So we kind of moved a little bit into this realm of, okay, now we know kind of what Auth is. We're integrating Auth into maybe a Remix application, just because that's kind of what we just started talking about a little bit. So we kind of have that there. We kind of started this conversation well with the thought of like, hey, front end developers don't necessarily think like back end developers, but like here's some stuff front end developers need to know about. Like, how can we bridge that gap for a lot of front end developers now that we kind of like have the groundwork? Like, what are things they need to be thinking about that's maybe different in their psychology versus, the psychology of a back end developer and where we are now?
Yeah, I think, and I can just speak mostly my own experience, because there was definitely a point where I was only doing front end work, and I was always really afraid of the back end. So I from my perspective, there were a few challenges. First and foremost, it's just imposter syndrome. Like there's this idea that if you're a front end, and I don't know where this idea came from. I think it's actually kind of silly, but there's this idea that like back end people are just smarter than front end people, and that's just like fundamentally not true. I mean, not to dismiss back end people at all, but like there's nothing that inherently makes you smarter or dumber on any side of the stack. It's just like what you've decided to focus on, and kind of like what brings you the most joy in some cases, or just how you think. Like I think front end engineers oftentimes think more visually, and it's for one reason or another, like things just click a little bit better when you can see the results directly on your screen, rather than having to like internalize all of these more abstract concepts that manifest in like JSON blobs or whatever, rather than having like a nice GUI interface that you can point to and said, I built that. Like that's like, for me, like the most satisfaction I get out of building anything is being able to see the product. And so when you work on the back end, oftentimes you don't really have much to see. Like there's a lot that you've done, and you can sort of like see it underneath that visual layer. And I think exposing these concepts in a way that connects visually with people. So like a great example is in the server client back and forth that I talked about. So going from login screen to dashboard, like what different steps are involved in that process, and sort of like visualizing that, and bringing it back to the application that you see on screen, I think is a really cool way to understanding how that flow of information works. Something that a lot of folks maybe not notice when they're logging into an app via GitHub or Google or whatever, is if you just pay attention to your URL bar, and see how it changes between the time that you click login on the website, authenticate via that service, and then end up back on your website. Just watch the URL bar, see what it does, right? And then imagine that as kind of like the flight path of these different requests that are going off that have to be the things that have to be authenticated at each step. Imagining that through your URL, and what does that actually look like? I think mapping that out in a visual way can help that connect with the average front end developer more than, say, just like explaining it academically or just having a a step-by-step process. Finding some way to communicate that visually would, I think, for someone like me, certainly really, really helpful. Like just even drawing maps and charts and just some way to make that connect. Really, really
Almost.
powerful. Same thing with like databases. Like to me, databases were actually one of the harder topics to learn as a front end engineer, because with databases, everything feels very ephemeral. Like the longest time I was just like, but where is my data? Like there's no like, I can't open a table unless you have like PHP my admin or something like that. You have some sort of like third party layer of like, here's visually how you manage your data. But like, unless you have that, and a lot of times you don't, you're like, I don't even understand where this is or how this like fits into the, like, it's not, I can't double click a database icon on my desktop and like, there it is. There it is on my hard drive, right? Like there's no, it felt very ephemeral. And just, yeah,
Nobody ever
finding
told you
ways to
about
like connect
PHP
that.
admin?
What's
Nobody told
that?
you about PG admin or
Oh, no, no, no.
Sequel
Yeah,
Pro?
these tools absolutely exist, but they're all tools to sort of like help facilitate the fact that the database itself is not just like a file system. Like it's not, it's very different, right? Like it's different than how we think about data on our computer or whatever. Um, or when we think about data in like a visual table. So like I guess my point is that like it's not inherently a visual thing, and you need these tools to sort of fill in the gaps for people who aren't comfortable working with it directly on the command line or something. Um, so
So what's your recommendation then for, let's say I got a front end developer here who's like,
mhm.
yeah, that database thing, I totally am empathizing with everything you're saying. That's how I feel right now. Like, what's your recommendation for that person to go from I'm feeling scared about even approaching databases to here's the diagram, here's where you want to look, here's what's going to help you learn this thing?
I mean, it really is starting, like you want to start at the ground up. And Jamie says diagrams, diagrams, diagrams. I completely agree. Um, the more diagrams you can draw, the better it is, the easier it is to connect certain things. But really starting at that lowest level of like, what even is a database? Like what does it represent? What are the different manifestations of databases, and what kind of things do they all share in common? And why is that better than just having like a plain text file or like a JSON blob or something that stores that, in a way that you can just look at it? And like JSON, I think for a lot of us makes a lot of sense because it's an object that we're comfortable with because we work with objects in JavaScript or whatever. But databases are a completely different beast, and they're set up this way for a reason. Specifically, relational databases. Establishing these relationships is often far and away more efficient than having to make certain connections and relationships when working with like a JSON blob, for example. And so, really just kind of like starting at the ground level and having a lot of diagrams to sort of get past that very early discomfort with the idea because it feels very different. I think that's really important. And for me, I spent a lot of time early in my career reading a lot about databases, and it just took so long to get from like zero to one, just because like the underlying concepts just did not make any sense because they were explained in a way that didn't connect for my very, very visual brain. And yeah, the more diagrams, the more visuals you have that can explain these concepts, I think the easier it is for these things to connect. Often doesn't help to, or doesn't hurt to make them very appealing. A lot of us like very pretty things. So the prettier your visuals are, the better. Or maybe like just the better analogies that relate them back to real life. All different mechanisms, but as long as they're visual, I think visual first is a really good place to start.
And I guess maybe a question towards that is, Where can I find those visuals?
You
have
will
those
eventually
visuals?
find them in my course.
All right. Yeah, that's the answer I think we needed.
Yeah, there. Like I said, the course is slated to launch in the next probably, I'd say a little less than a year. So still got a lot to work on there. But I will also be releasing content periodically over email too. So if you are interested in that sort of thing, you'll get a lot of diagrams in your email if you sign up for my newsletter on front2back.dev. So before the full course launches, there will be content.
I'm looking to see if there's any other questions.
Yeah, open book. Go for it. Anybody got anything?
That was good to go through everything. I mean, Chance, do you have anything else for us? This is just such a good primer. I know it's just one module. So
Yeah.
it's like, oh my gosh. I mean, so the course that you're launching, how many hours of content, or is it going to be like a walk as you go 3-day course, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, yeah, I wouldn't set it it's definitely a self-paced course. So, how long it takes you is going to depend on how much time you're committing to it. And hopefully it'll be designed in a way that very much facilitates that go as you want pace. Like I don't expect any particular, like it's divided into modules, and then each module is divided into lessons. And so each lesson will probably be no more than like say 30 minutes of content of like straight content, but then there will also be like exercises and things for you to do along the way, and how much time you spend on those exercises obviously is totally up to you. So the goal is to make it very self-driven, because we're all busy. Most of us have full-time jobs, and we want to spend a little time on education, but we don't want to feel overwhelmed. So and also dividing it up into modules, I think, is helpful because it's non-linear. You won't necessarily have to go through like if you're already super comfortable with authentication, but you don't know anything about, say, database management or how to choose database A to database B, you can jump around, right? Like you can go through the modules you want to, or you can just go in the order that you want to. I'm trying to design it in a way where there aren't like a bunch of dependencies. Like there will be like an intro module or whatever that, obviously if you don't have any background in front-end development, something like an intro primer would be really good to start. But it should be hopefully very easy to go through no matter where you're starting from.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. I'm so excited to see it come
Yeah, and so
out.
there's a bunch of different so just like a quick, high level overview of some of the modules we're planning. We have authentication, we have databases, we have caching. Caching is going to be a whole nightmare scenario that a lot of people are very afraid of. I used to be very afraid of thinking about caching. So I'm actually looking forward to building that one out. We're going to talk about your relational databases versus non-relational databases. A little bit about like containers. We'll talk a little bit about cron jobs and different types of things that might you needing to manage time on your server. So there's a bunch of different areas we'll be talking about.
Awesome. Okay. Well, super excited about that. And again, definitely follow Chance on Twitter at Chance the Dev. You should like have some guitar, like every module has like a little guitar intro or something. That'd be really cool and fun.
Yeah, I was obviously you see behind me, I do like to play guitar, but I also surf, and so I was actually going for more of a surfing vibe in a lot of my visuals. So
yeah,
expect some surfing related content if you're interested in that sort of thing. Maybe I'll throw in some guitar stuff.
that's fun. Okay, well, we're super excited. Thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks, Chance, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Sometimes it's hard to bridge the gap between business objectives and tech implementation, and it can get messy. This dot is trusted by top names like Meta, Google, and T-Mobile, and they love helping business leaders fulfill their strategic digital initiatives. Check them out at thisdot.co. One more time, that's THISDOT.co.